This is Wiretap. It's a two-channel slope detector or motion detector, which is a pretty rare type of utility in Eurorack. The basic idea is that you feed in a control voltage, like a pitch sequence or an LFO, and Wiretap will generate various triggers or gates based on whether that signal is changing and which direction it's moving in. It's quite a simple idea, but it opens up a world of patching that's quite hard to achieve otherwise without using fairly complex combinations of slew, comparators and logic. I've been using it to generate modulation and drum triggers from the note changes in a simple sequence. And I've used it to split a sequence between two voices based on whether notes are going up or down in pitch. It's handy for creating note triggers when you're manipulating a pitch sequence in the time domain. You can use it at audio rates too to generate interesting glitchy pulse waves. It opens up some interesting ways to generate drum triggers from smooth movements or recorded gestures. And it can create events to drive sequences and voices as part of a complex self-playing patch. Wiretap is made by Yuhi, who are kindly sponsoring this video. They're probably best known for their software plugin instruments, but they've quietly released a couple of pretty interesting and unique hardware modules on the side. First CV-lisation, and now this. I've had a lot of fun coming up with these patch ideas for Wiretap, so let's get straight into it and I'll walk you through the concept and the interface as we go. So at first glance, the Wiretap front panel might look a little bit cryptic, but it's actually pretty straightforward. We've got two processing channels, both arranged in columns. The inputs are at the top, and below the input there's a through output, which is just a copy of that input signal. That can be really useful if you're patching in, say, a pitch sequence and want to just send that through to an oscillator without needing a separate mult. Below the input section, we've got these various processing outputs. So Wiretap essentially monitors that input voltage and generates gates when that voltage changes in either direction, up or down. In channel 1, we've got this rising output. That generates a gate when the signal starts to rise, and we've got a moving output, which generates a gate whenever the signal changes in either direction. Channel 2 has a falling output. That generates a gate when the signal starts to fall, and a step output, and that is similar to the moving output, but it will only generate a gate if the input voltage jumps by at least a semitone, so on a volt per octave scale, at least a 1/12 of a volt. Should say also that channel 2 is normal to channel 1, so with nothing at the channel 2 input, you will get all four of these outputs processing the channel 1 signal. Below these four outputs, we've got these higher and lower outputs. These are kind of comparators. The left output here goes high when the channel 1 voltage starts to go above channel 2, or 0 volts if nothing's plugged into channel 2, and the right side goes high whenever the channel 1 voltage drops below channel 2 or below 0 volts. At the bottom, we've got a pair of very simple release envelope generators. These have their own individual trigger inputs, which you can use with external sources, but they're also normal to the rising and falling outputs here. So basically you'll get little release envelopes generated from these rising and falling gates as well. This pot controls the overall gate time for all the outputs, so from very short triggers through to longer gates, and if an event happens again while the gate is still high, it won't re-trigger it, so you can use it for kind of clock dividing type behavior on periodic signals. The right-hand pot, finally, is the release time for both those envelopes together. So let's get a signal going in and we can see some of this stuff in action. I've got the octone step sequencer here. If I just get this going, I'm going to run that through the scope, and then I'm going to run it into channel 1, and that'll be normal to channel 2, so we can just process the same signal with both halves. And at the moment, all these steps are turned right down, so we're not getting any voltages changing, we're getting nothing happening. If I turn up one of the steps, you'll start to notice these LEDs flash, So as it jumps up to the high voltage, you'll get a high rising output, and then you'll get a falling output on the next step as it goes back down to 0. Let's get this connected into an oscillator so we can start hearing stuff. I'm going to use the MCO as the voice. I'm going to take the through there straight to the volt per octave input, and I'm going to use the step output of Wiretap to trigger the voice. MCO has its own built-in envelope, so let's just go into there. So now we're getting these two notes, one when the pitch rises and one when it falls again on the next step. If I start to turn up a couple of other steps, so this step output is generating gates whenever we get a new note, or whenever the note changes in pitch. And let's start using these rising and falling signals that Wiretap's generating to modulate the voice a bit. So I'm going to take the envelope outputs. So the left one is basically generating a little envelope every time that rising gate fires. I'm going to run that through the scope, so you get these little blue envelopes on the blue trace there. Let's go into modulating the wave shape on this wavetable oscillator. So now when the pitch rises, we get this bit of modulation happening. And let's do the same thing with the falling gate and modulate the AB mix in this voice. So now if I play with the sequence a bit, we're getting these quite interesting timbral changes which are directly tied to whether the note's higher or lower than the one before it. And if we start to randomize the sequence, or ping pong the sequence, say, so again, just to compare, without that modulation, get quite a static kind of tone. We can also use these trigger outputs to generate some percussive sounds. Let's patch in some drum sounds. Let's take a kick drum from that rising output, and a closed hi-hat from and let's take an open hat from the falling. I'm just going to take a clap from one of the direct step outputs on the sequencer. Now by playing with this sequence, we're getting rhythmic variation and tonal variation, which is predictable when we're looping the sequence like this, but if we start to randomize, so this simple single CV sequence, all I'm taking out of here is this CV output that's generating rhythms and some really interesting tonal modulation. One thing I've really enjoyed doing with Wiretap is using it to split a pitch sequence between two voices based on whether the notes in that sequence are going up or down in pitch. To demo this, I've got the key step 37. I'm going to take its pitch CV output only. I'm going to mult that to two voices, rings on the left, MCO Mark II on the right, and also to the Wiretap input. And then I'm going to use Wiretap to monitor that pitch information, and it will fire from the rising output a gate whenever the pitch goes up. That's going to trigger rings, and from the falling output, it will trigger whenever the pitch goes down, and that's going to trigger the MCO. So if I play a few notes on the keyboard, as they go up, they're triggering rings, and as they come back down again, they're playing the MCO, which is playing this kind of slightly fluty tone. And I've set this up on the scope, so the green trace is going to monitor the pitch, the red trace will be the MCO triggers, and the blue trace will be the rings triggers. Let's get a rising arpeggio played in. So we can see here as the notes are going up, we're getting these blue triggers which are firing rings. When it drops back down to the start again, we're getting a single trigger on MCO. If we reverse the direction of the arpeggio, let's bring in a little bit of delay and reverb here as well. Do some reverb in the box just to make the sound a bit fuller. We can play with the various other arpeggio playback modes in the key step. So this is the kind of up and down mode where it's repeating the top and bottom notes. And of course when we repeat that note, we're not getting any actual changes in pitch, so it's not triggering, which is quite a nice effect as well. And if we go into the random mode, this is where things get quite interesting, because not only is it randomizing the note order, but depending on whether each successive note is higher or lower than one before, it'll trigger one or the other voice. Extend the range a bit here as well. We can go into the note order mode as well. And of course you can program sequences too. Control over which note fires when, or which voice fires when rather. Now, one of the things that Wiretap is really useful for is generating timing event information from non-standard pitch sequences. For example, if you're manipulating the output of a sequencer in the time domain and it becomes divorced from the original kind of gates and triggers, or if you're using some kind of non-standard CV to use as a pitch sequence, whether that's an LFO or some other CV source in your system. I've been playing around with the Make Noise multi-mod quite a bit this week. I've just borrowed this from work. I probably will end up keeping it because it's pretty cool. And I'm going to take an 8-step sequence from Octone into multi-mod, and I'm going to take two of the multi-mod outputs into the two channels of Wiretap and use them to control two voices. And what multi-mod will let me do is take two copies of that sequence and play with the relative phase going to the two voices, and also compress and expand that sequence in time. Now, obviously, if I'm using the gate outputs or the trigger outputs from the original sequencer, pretty soon, if I'm doing that stuff in multi-mod, the timing information will have no relationship anymore to the pitch changes. So where Wiretap comes in is it will generate triggers for those envelopes when the notes change in their new time relationship, rather than when the original steps fire on the sequence, which is really useful. So in this patch, I've got two voices set up again. I've got one in this little skiff off screen, which is the triphase oscillator from New Systems Instruments, going through the Instro Tri and the Expert Sleeper's Persephone. And the second voice is the ALM MCO Mark II again. And if I just get the sequence running, we'll just listen to the triphase voice to start with. So just a really simple kind of sawtooth classic subtractive sound. I've got multimod set with the phase at 0, spread in the center. I'm not clocking it yet, I've just got the time set in the middle. And if I open up the second voice, the MCO, just hear that on its own for a second. So they're just playing in unison, and we can see the shape of the pitch sequence on the scope there. If I start to play with the phase, this will start to affect the phase of the MCO voice, and it'll start to delay it relative to the... And we've got this very smooth, gradual shifting of that phase until we're a complete step apart. We can keep going. You'll notice from these note triggers that they're each playing triggers when the notes change rather than when the sequencer originally would fire those gates. Just bring that back again. And we can also play with a spread, which gets pretty extreme quite quickly, but this will play with the actual time relationship. I'll just mute the MCO for a second. So that's slowed the sequence down that's playing the triphase oscillator. We can play with both of these together, so let's play with the phase as well. So without Wiretap, we'd be getting these pitch changes, but we wouldn't have any way of actually articulating the notes. Let's just reset that. Let's try clocking the multimod. And what that will do is it will constrain these phase shifts to whole steps. So we can instantly make this feel quite kind of rhythmically tight. Just add a bit of delay. Make the rhythm a bit more complex, and we can play with the spread as well. So yeah, this combination of multimod with Wiretap articulating the notes can really get some super complex multi-phase shifted sequencing going on from a single source. So on the back of Wiretap there are a couple of jumpers that unlock a couple of extra modes, and for the purposes of this video I've just broken out those jumpers onto these switches on this DIY panel here just to save me unscrewing the module whenever I want to change modes. I'm going to talk about clocked mode in the next patch, but I'm going to talk about hold mode in this patch. Hold mode is quite interesting. By default, Wiretap will fire out a gate on these various outputs when the signal changes. What hold mode does is holds that gate high until the signal changes again, or until that condition is no longer true. So if a signal starts to rise, in default mode, it will generate a gate at a length you specify when that change happens. When hold mode is on, it will go, that output will go high when it starts to rise, and it will stay high until it stops rising. And that can be quite interesting when you're doing generative patches, as you'll see a bit later on as well. But what I actually want to use it for in this patch is audio rate manipulation. Wiretap's not really designed to run at audio rate, and it's a bit glitchy when you do, but it does produce some quite interesting tones. So that's what I'm going to play with in this patch. I've got a saw wave, which you can see on the scope, coming in from the triphase oscillator off screen. And that's coming into Wiretap, not looking at any of the outputs yet, but if I was to look at, say, the higher or lower output. So I'll just take the higher output. This will be high, will go high, or will generate a gate when the signal goes above 0 volts. So you can see with this very short gate time that I've set, we're getting this little narrow pulse, and that sounds like this. If I play with the gate time pot, we get PWM effectively. And because it doesn't re-trigger, we can actually go down an octave or two. Now this gate time won't change as the frequency changes, which can be quite interesting, as we'll hear in a minute. But look what happens if I engage hold mode. Now this output is high for as long as the input signal is above 0 volts, higher than 0, so the first half of that bipolar wave. If we go into the lower output, we'll get the same thing, but for the second half of the wave. And if we go into these other outputs, we get slightly stranger, less predictable, noisier outputs. If I turn hold mode off for a second, you can see the moving higher and lower all produce kind of variations on these pulse waves. So let's go here and engage hold mode. And let's envelope that. And let's run a pitch sequence. So we get this nice glitchy square wave. It's a bit like the sound you get when you use a clock divider to make a square sub-oscillator. I can mix in the saw as well. Here's the saw on its own. Let's just filter that down a bit. Use the same envelope. And let's bring in the Wiretap square again. I think it adds a really interesting texture. And let's play with turning hold mode off. We're going to get these short pulses. Just going to mute the saw again. And we get these kind of strange octave effects as well as it divides or doesn't divide. So yeah, just a little taste of what Wiretap can do at audio rates. As I say, it's kind of glitchy, a little bit unpredictable. Hold mode does help if you want to create a more traditional comparator-derived kind of square like this. Notice when hold mode's on, by the way, that the gate time doesn't have any effect. Because it's not generating it's not triggering a gate, it's just maintaining its state. So the other mode you can activate using a rear panel jumper, or a front panel switch in my case, is the clocked mode. And what that will do is turn input 2 into a clock input, and then the changes produced when the signal on channel 1 is processed will only occur when a clock signal is present. So it will effectively rhythmically quantize all these output events to the input clock. This can be quite fun for generating drum triggers out of slowly moving CV, which would always be locked to the grid of the timing of those drums. So I'm going to feed in a 16th note clock on channel 2. I've activated clock mode. I've also activated hold mode because that tends to lead to more reliable results with slow moving CV, which is what I'm going to be doing in this with a joystick. I programmed in a few simple drum sounds. I've got Squid Sample just off screen as my sort of drum sample source. And if I just get the basic pattern going, so this is just a kick and some hi-hats. I've got a 16th note clock coming into channel 2, and I've got the rising and falling outputs going through the scope to trigger a couple of other sounds. So I'm basically going to generate triggers on the rising and falling outputs as this input CV rises or falls. So if I connect this joystick, and I've connected the Y output, so the vertical axis, if I push this forward, as that's moving, because the clock's coming in, it's going to generate triggers in time with that clock, and if I pull it backwards, it's going to trigger the falling output, which will trigger a clap sound. And by moving this joystick forward and backward, we can kind of play little so it's quite a nice performance tool. It only triggers while it's moving, and it triggers a different sound depending on which direction you're moving the joystick. If you've got some kind of CV recorder, like the Bella Gliss that I've got here, you can take this a step further and record a gesture. Like that, and I can now trigger this every 2 bars. So we can see my finger movement being played back, and we're getting this quite interesting snare and clap pattern as a result of that. So it's kind of an unusual way to come up with drum patterns. Again, very live performable, but also quite fun with a CV recorder like this. Okay, to finish, it's a sort of self-playing ambient patch where Wiretap is kind of generating all the timing information that's needed. Got rings, got the octone again with the melodic sequence. But I'm clocking octone from Wiretap, and I'm feeding Wiretap with a mix of 2 sine LFOs from this quad LFO here, one of which is being FM'd subtly by another one, so we're getting this kind of quite complex LFO shape. That's going into Wiretap. I'm taking the rising output to clock the sequencer, and I'm taking the moving output to hit the strum on rings, and I'm taking the envelope outputs, which are normal to the rising and falling, and they're modulating brightness and damping on rings. So if I just turn up some reverb on clouds just off screen, and let's bring in a bit of the granular effects on clouds as well. If I play with the frequencies of these LFOs and the mix of them, change this complex shape being fed into Wiretap. This patch kind of evolves itself. It's something that is really kind of unique to Wiretap, I think, this idea of taking a moving signal and generating various different timing elements from it. So whether you're doing this kind of more free-form ambient kind of stuff, or more rhythmic stuff in the clock mode, or with more rhythmical input signals, I think it really brings a whole new dimension to patching, really, which is quite rare these days. And I know you can patch similar kinds of things using other modules, using comparators and logic and stuff, but having this in one kind of inexpensive 6HP module with the built-in envelopes is pretty smart, I think. So yeah, thanks to Yuhi for sending it over. Thanks for watching. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you've got a little flavour of what it can do. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like and a comment, and I'll see you next time.